Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Friends, welcome to the Encounter program sponsored by the Broome County Council of Churches. I'm your host, Mark Kimpland, the pastor at the Endwell United Methodist Church. Today I conclude my fall series of welcoming, introducing, listening to, and learning from new pastors in Broome County, and I'm excited to introduce our guest today, the Reverend Dave Wickins, who is the pastor at the Castle Creek and Glen Castle United Methodist Churches. Dave, welcome to Encounter.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Glad you're here. Glad we finally made this happen.
We did.
So, yes, we did. Well, let's jump right into it. Why don't we start with a little bit of your history, some of the foundational things that happened in your life from childhood or wherever you want to take this so that our viewers and listeners have a foundation of who Dave is. So I'll let you go.
It's been an interesting journey. I've often told people what would make a quiet, shy kid with stuttering problems and speech impediments stand up and serving the Lord for 25 years. The short answer was God. Okay. But born near Cleveland, Ohio, but grew up near the Buffalo area. And I grew up in the average semi-functional family. I think most folks can relate to that. Yes. I had a dad who worked hard to help give us a better life that he had, a mom that ended up staying home to take care of us. And on the outside, everything was great. But underneath, I had the semi-functional reality of dad often being out and about, so mom often kind of drank her woes away, and dad was out with the boys. Okay. And so I kind of grew up trying to figure out life and faith, and if there was a God who was out there and where, and not necessarily growing up in the church. It was that journey to figure out where God was for me. And as God began to help me to understand where God was in my life, I began to say, how can I help other folks figure out this God on the journey? So,
yeah. Now, take us through that. That must have been a very confusing childhood then in some respects, trying to put those pieces together. The church wasn't a part of your upbringing at that time, or it was, or?
Well, I joked around as a kid. I wondered why I kept hearing the same two sermons twice a year. You know, you go twice a year. Why do you keep hearing about Jesus being born and being raised from the dead?
Yes.
And, you know, that was kind of the journey. And in between, trying to figure out where things were. And eventually I figured out there's got to be a creator. How can you look at this world as complex as it is and not think there's a God that's out there? But I figured there had to be a God who kind of wound it up and then let us fend for ourselves. And eventually I began to see a God who was trying to act and interact and be involved in my life and help me to find a whole bunch of peace and healing. And once God began to do that for me, the journey kind of transformed to how can I try to help other folks find a loving and healing God that can be part of this hurting, broken world. And so it was that journey from twice a year to once in a while to when I was 8 years old, I first answered an altar call. There was a place called the Chapel in Buffalo, and they had a Christmas program called the Living Singing Christmas Tree. We went, they offered people to go to the altar. I said, Mom, I want to go down. I was 8 years old, and Mom said, do you really know what you're doing? I said, yeah, I want to give my heart to God. And so that was kind of the beginning of the journey of getting to know this God better.
Yeah. So what happened after that then? I mean, an 8-year-old going to the altar to accept Christ. What happens after that then? Did you do that alone, or was?
There were other people that went down, but I was just the one that went down in the family, and then we kind of went back to that normal twice a year kind of deal for a while.
Okay.
And when I was 13 years old, Mom asked if I'd go to confirmation class. We had some connection with the United Methodist Church, and it turned out Mom said she finally connected with a pastor who she thought finally believed what he was saying. She just really connected with him and asked me to be a part of it. And I agreed, mostly because I was in Boy Scouts. Scouts had really had a powerful part of my life. And in the end of the Scout law, it says a Scout is reverent. And so I said, if I'm going to be a good Boy Scout, I should start exploring this faith thing. So I went through confirmation. There was still a influential person in my life. Lloyd Hahn had led the confirmation class, and it was really a very open-ended exploring your faith. But once I was confirmed, I wanted to continue on the journey. So I continued to go to church. Eventually, Mom kind of faded out again, but my sister and I kind of went for a while, got connected with youth group and their softball team and canoe trips and those highly theological things, but somehow God used that to get a hold of me. So I began a journey.
So that took you through your high school years and such things. What happens next? What happens after that?
Through high school and college, it was a transformation of me to sit in church and try to understand this big God. That the first time I felt like I heard God calling in my life it wasn't an audible voice, but I had the impression that God was drawing me. And I still remember I was between the fellowship hall and sanctuary of the church I was at. I felt like God tapping me on the shoulder. And I looked up and said, "Quiet, shy kid, I could never do that kind of thing. I could never stand up and talk in front of folks." But I tried to blame it on the fact that it was a youth group retreat. It was 3 a.m. and I was full of caffeine and sugar.
Yes.
But for 8 years, I just continued to feel God tugging on me. That even in high school, I ended up playing football and ended up having a knee injury. Spent a few years on and off crutches and surgery and other things, and it still became that dark night of figuring out where God was in the middle of all that. And I ended up graduating from high school, ended up going to college. I started out as an engineer because Dad was an engineer, and I was a miserable engineer. And I went from struggling deeply with my own childhood to somehow beginning to get a burden to how could I make other kids' lives better. And I did physical therapy for a little while in college because blowing out my knee and other people being there for me. But then I ended up in psychology and early childhood development. To saying, how can I do an ounce of prevention? How can I help other children to get through life, to be able to deal with whatever life has brought, but hopefully find a better path? So I ended up thriving in that in college, and it kind of took me on a journey to helping out at the YMCA with their after-school programs, did middle and high school rec programs and other things during college. And when I graduated, I ended up working at a place called Father Baker's. And it was a juvenile home for youth, one of the last places where they'd often send kids by the courts before they'd give up on them. My first 2 days of training were pins and holds, how to pin kids to the ground and hold them there. But the more I looked at their journey, the more I began to see what they had been through. And I could connect with their journey and what had brought the hurt and pain to cause them to make bad choices. And I had the heart to say, how can I be there for them? Ended up working for the Boy Scouts. I had the privilege of earning Eagle Scout. My dad ended up, and I got to know each other through his busy work schedule. He became Cub Master and Scout Master. And I was privileged to have earned Eagle Scout. And for an organization that gave so much to me, it was a chance to give back. So I kind of used that psych and early childhood stuff to make an impact on an area in Buffalo. 100 groups and hundreds of thousands of kids and hundreds of leaders to an ounce of prevention. And so I did that for a few years.
Friends, that's intriguing. Friends, we are here with the Reverend Dave Wickins, the pastor at the Castle Creek and Glen Castle United Methodist Church, and just beginning our time of history and what has shaped his life and such. So you're working in Scouts and such things, something that blessed you, and you want to be a blessing to others and such things. And you still have this, correct me, I don't want to speak for you, but there's still this call that's happening in your heart and your spirit. Can you kind of shape that for us a little bit?
Well, about the time I worked for the Boy Scouts, within 2 weeks I ended up marrying the woman who I'd still choose over any other. I hope she can hear it and see if I can get some brownie points.
There you go.
Within 6 months of working for the Boy Scouts, I'm working in a great career helping others. married to the woman who I'd still choose over any other, a rock, a support, patience, and guide, and living in a nice ranch home in Waynesville. Everything I'd want, but there's still an emptiness inside of me. And I felt like it was probably more than the second time for 8 years. I just felt like God was tapping on my shoulder.
Okay.
But it almost felt like like God was just not letting me go. And I still showed up to church most of the time.
Okay.
And I'm still trying to figure out where God is in this crazy world. And January 10th of 1992, I hear the tapping again. And I decide God and I are going to have a conversation. I figured out there had to be a creator. But truth be told, I was a little frustrated by church. And as the teenager, I grew up and I admittedly looked around, and at times I would see a group of little old ladies that would point and whisper. And it just drove me crazy. The first scripture I ever memorized was "Judge not lest ye be judged," even in the old King James Version. And I combined it with what I figure is a Native American saying, to walk a mile in someone's shoes. That eventually Mom faded out of church. Dad never really got connected in church other than choir a little bit and helping with canoe trips and things. And it didn't work that way, but I almost felt like they pointed at my mom and dad.
Okay.
Oh, they're those people that struggle with alcohol. Not realizing what's behind the journey of addiction and self-medicating and what had gone on in their lives to bring them to that point.
Yeah.
And I was ready to kind of walk away from church deal.
Yeah.
And I felt God tapping on the shoulder. And January 10th of 1992, I claimed to be logical in thinking. My way of dealing with the world was to try to shut my emotions off.
Okay.
But that really didn't work. I'm 22 years old, and I've already got 2 ulcers in my stomach from trying to be in control.
Right.
And so I take this walk so God and I can have a talk. And to be honest, I felt a calling on my life that I was trying to get away from. I'm this quiet, shy, stuttering kid, don't want to talk in front of folks. God, let me out of this. And so I took a walk in a set of woods, and I was going to talk with God. And I figured out there had to be a God, but that was a distant, uninvolved God. And so I'm going to fly under the radar. I'm going to go into a set of woods in a snowstorm. I'm going to ask for some signs. They're not going to happen. I can get out of ministry and move on with my life.
That's right.
God's got a sense of
for you?
humor 25 years later.
Yeah.
And it's a long, complicated journey where, if you know Buffalo, not too different from Binghamton, there was a snowstorm. I claim to be logical in thinking. There's 1 to 2 feet of snow that day that fell on the ground, 1 to 2 more on the way. And I'm walking in a set of woods, fighting through branches and wind and all sorts of things. And all of a sudden, I almost feel like God's reaching back to me that day. And the shorter version is I ended up getting to a clearing and trying to sort out where God is. And all of a sudden, it's the surreal moment. The wind stops, almost like a snow globe, thin, fluffy flakes just gradually coming to the ground. And God and I have a conversation. For the first time, I'm talking, and I feel like God's reaching back. And again, the slightly shorter version, if it's possible for a preacher, is I almost felt like God said, Dave, you're trying to be in control of your life. How's that working for you? You got everything you want, but there's still something missing. And he said, are you going to really let go? And the shorter version, I hadn't cried in years. I just held in all the hurt and pain of being the short, chubby, stuttering kid that got picked on to living in the semi-functional home of warm, loving, caring parents that tried until they had a little too much to drink, and then it got crazy. You know, that's what I was trying to figure out, all that hurt and pain. And I poured it out all that day in the woods. I shed tears. It's not the macho thing to admit, but I poured it out, but I felt a peace I had never felt before. And a joy that I had never experienced. And as I did, I almost felt like God saying, are you going to let me lead? Let me be in control. Are you willing to surrender? And as I felt that peace and joy, I almost felt like I told God, I'll go where you want me to go, and I'll do what you want me to do.
Okay. Is that how it worked out?
It's not often been where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the gift is God always knows better than I do.
Yes, indeed.
That somehow God has been wherever I went, and what went from God being out there somewhere to God being right there.
Yeah.
The day I poured it out, I felt a peace and a healing that I looked anywhere and everywhere else to find.
Good.
And I felt like God said, Dave, now you've got to go out and realize I am there, I do care, that in this hurting, broken world, I actively reached out to you, and there's a lot of other people in the world that are hurting, that need to forgive and be forgiven and find healing. And so that began the next part of the journey to getting ready to go out there and serve God. And
so from that time
God's
of the call to the time that you begin that act of putting the steps together, or many times we call hoops, those things that we do, how long was that process approximately?
It was about 2.5 years.
Okay, all right, good.
But it was, I joke around that when I first opened the book, I didn't know there was a 1 in front of John. I thought it was a typo. I had never really opened it. I opened the book as a kid. I sat in my closet reading the Bible stories, and even David and Goliath, and thinking, wow, if God can help me be like David and defeat the Goliaths in life. But after that day in the woods, the book became real to me. It came alive, and it became my story. I began to connect with it. And after that day, I started craving talking to God, because I realized God was listening. And it became that 2.5 journey of preparation of ended up finding that church with a pastor who just mentored me, took me under his wing, and helped me to better understand the scriptures and my own journey of faith.
That's awesome.
And get me ready.
Friends, we're here with the Reverend Dave Wickins, the pastor at the Castle Creek and Glen Castle United Methodist Churches, and exploring his journey and call into ministry and such. And so eventually you end up in seminary, and you graduated from
United Theological Seminary.
Okay, and what happens after that time?
Well, the irony was I graduated in 2000, but I started ministry in September of 1994. I just figured out God gave me the sense it was time to go into ministry. I thought it was time for seminary, but the week before I started seminary, I ended up pastoring 2 churches and helping at a 3rd.
Awesome. Good.
I looked up at God and said, no, wait a minute, I haven't started seminary yet. But there were 2 loving, patient congregations that allowed me to learn and grow and serve. And the churches and I really learned and grew together. And I served them until about the time I graduated, and God worked, and people came, and hearts and lives began to be touched and changed the way mine were. And so I graduated from seminary, and soon after that I ended up going to different locations and serving other churches. And to backtrack, my daughter was born 2 weeks after I started as a pastor. So that was the journey of having 1 child come in the way, and 2 years later having another child come. And all of a sudden there were 4 on the journey. So
A little different perspective when that happens, isn't it?
That's for sure.
So that you then start serving wherever the bishop and God send you and such, that has brought you to this part of the woods.
That's for sure.
What can you share with us about the congregations at Castle Creek and Glen Castle and such things that you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
It's been a wonderful journey for us, that after 25 years of serving God, the joys and challenges for my family and I were huge, helping congregations deal with stuff, and taking a little break, being part of 2 churches that are firm believers in a loving and a caring God, believing in the Word, but also in loving everyone around them. And we got here, and they took us under their wing and just loved us. And as we're getting to know one another, see how God can do great things. And they're a great group that they've got 3 different AA groups meeting in their congregation. And many of those folks through love, are getting connected with the church family as well. So they're offering those kind of ministries, and they do outreach ministries. They do free dinners for folks that want to come. They do once a week, they pack meals and send those out to homeless folks. Once a month, they actually provide meals to a bunch of shut-ins.
Wonderful.
So it's cool to see them not only live out their faith, but to reach out to folks who are truly in need.
Yeah.
So it's been a blessing to begin to get a part of that and get to know them.
And that's an interesting time, especially within that first year or two. It's still that getting to know one another and trust and kind of building on the foundation that's been built before you were there, and all those dynamics.
Very much so.
Let me ask you this. You've had quite a journey. And I appreciate you sharing your foundation to that journey and the struggles in that journey. But here we are in almost 2020.
Right.
What do you see as you can list a few if you want, the present day challenges of the church, especially where we are, and perhaps even within the United Methodist Church, or you can take that wherever you want to take it. But what do you see as the challenges, the present day challenges?
I think for me, one of the greatest challenges has been one of the greatest blessings is in the United Methodist Church is what we've called unity and diversity. Mm-hmm. And I think the blessing for me is for 8 years I sat in a church that gave me room to explore what I believed without having it pressed on me. To meeting me where I was, to having conversations and dialogue, but not saying this is what you think or how you have to feel or believe. Mm-hmm. But I think that's resulted in people with a wide variety of thoughts, beliefs, and ideas. Mm-hmm. And for me, that is the greatest gift and the challenge, is to be able to have that diversity. But when you have that diversity, trying to sort through, how do we love each other when we don't always think or feel the same way?
Yes.
And so I think it's how do you navigate trying to meet someone where they are. And I think for me, having folks that were loving and patient with me, meeting me where I was, and helping gradually introduce me to the God that helped me to find love and healing. Is still the burden that I have, is how can we meet people wherever they are, to love other folks where they are the way God loves us, and how can we come along on the journey together?
Right. So what gets you up in the morning? What excites you? And I think I'm getting an inkling of what that answer may or may not be. There may be a few things, but what excites you about ministry? I mean, what are those moments that either take your breath away or add more life to the breath that you have? What excites you about ministry, and finally answering that call and living that call out?
I think it's been the blessing of walking alongside people on the journey. And for me, even with a lot of my schoolwork and other things, it's how to hear people's story. And to have people be willing to share the good, the bad, and the ugly, and not just the good. To be able to hopefully walk alongside others the way God has me, and to love us as we are, and yet to help people to find that love and healing and forgiveness for themselves and others, and to allow God to work. And I always thought it was working with kids, and I've done kids clubs and youth groups and those other kinds of things, but I found it's not only been outside of the church, but inside the church. There's a lot of hurting folks that sometimes put on the face and aren't always willing to admit they're hurting. But to be able to get past what's on the outside, admit there's stuff going on, walk alongside people, and help them to find that healing journey is what's been exciting for me.
How have you been able to do that? How are there specifics as to, because you're right, I try to get away from the idea of asking anyone, so how you doing? Well, you're going to get the same answer every single time and such things, but to be able to engage at a deeper level in that moment and such things. So how have you been able to do that? How have you been able to get to that deeper level with people who are hurting, who do many times come to church or worship and wear a mask and looks great on the outside, but boy, if you only knew where I was right now. How are there things that you've done that have helped that process?
I think it's been be willing to do the most difficult thing for me, and that's be vulnerable. and admit my own journey, and to kind of be willing to share. I joke around, I come from the average semi-functional family, and how much that can open the door for other people to admit it, to share some of my journey and the struggle, but the God who's helped me to get through that. Yeah. And to be able to walk us alongside and know that that's sometimes a journey and not just a pinpoint in time.
Yeah.
Has opened that door. And truthfully, sometimes I'll ask someone twice, how you doing? You hear good. Now, how are you really doing?
Absolutely.
You mean you really want to know? And to be able to sometimes open that door and be patient is great when you hear people willing to do that.
Yes, yeah. And to be able to do that amongst each other and trust one another. To be those healing agents as Christ has healed us and such. I think that's, so you speak of a vulnerability also, that's real important in that relationship, to say, hey, right. Been there, done that, and still going through it. Because one of the things that I'm impressed about what I've heard from you, Dave, and we only have about just a few minutes left, is that it is a journey.
Yes, very much so.
And we're all on this journey, and we all bring different things into this journey, our past, our foundations, where we think we might be heading. Is there a final, as we wrap up our time here, is there a final nugget of truth or a struggle, or is there anything else you want to share about this time that we've shared together? I've been fascinated by your story, but maybe in a chapter now that needs to be written, or is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
I think the blessing has been to, as I get to know these two congregations, to be part of two loving, patient, caring church families that can embrace people as we are on the journey and walk it together. And to be able to have someone say, can we talk, is what excites me. And to know if there's folks out there that have been hurt in life outside or inside the walls, if there's someone they say, can we talk, to listen, care, and not face judgment, is what I'm hoping we can be there for folks.
It's amazing that you say that, because that was your conversation with God when you took the walk so many years ago. So, Dave, thank you for sharing your spirit, your passion, your love for God and others. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And friends, thank you for being a part of the Encounter program. I hope it has been a blessing to you. And I ask God's peace to be with you this day and all of your days. Have a marvelous day, and God bless.